The lights burned hot over the studio, cameras fixed, audience hushed in expectation. It was supposed to be another predictable panel, politicians trading talking points, analysts circling the same tired themes. But then Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, her voice cutting through the air with a sharpness meant to wound. "You don't belong here. People like you never will." The words landed like a slap. For a moment, no one breathed. The audience's silence wasn't agreement, it was shock. It's disbelief that in this day and age, such arrogance could be spoken so openly, so casually. Her tone carried no hesitation, only smug certainty, as though belittling another person's. Identity was a birthright she had inherited. Kash Patel didn't flinch. He sat steady, eyes locked on her, his face unreadable. But the sting was undeniable. Living rooms across America, viewers felt it in their bones. Children of immigrants, families who had sacrificed, people who had fought to prove they belonged. They all heard her words as if directed at them. Some panelists shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. Others looked down, pretending not to notice. The moderator cleared his throat, but no one interrupted. The insult hung heavy, filling the space with tension so sharp it could split the room in two. Karoline smirked, convinced she had scored her point. For her, it was theater, a cheap performance designed to draw claps from her corner of the crowd. She didn't see the weight of what she had unleashed. She didn't realize she had just created a moment that would travel far beyond this studio, far beyond tonight. Patel let the silence stretch. His pause was deliberate, almost surgical. In that pause, the arrogance of her attack began to echo louder than her words. The cameras zoomed in. Viewers leaned forward. Something was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. What Leavitt assumed was a casual dismissal was, in truth, a spark that would ignite not just Patel's response, but a broader firestorm about who gets to define belonging, who gets to claim America, and who has the courage to stand tall in the face of condescension. And then, with a single sentence, Patel shattered the script. His reply didn't just silence the room, it changed the entire conversation. The insult could have passed as just another sharp exchange in America's endless cycle of televised debates. But something about that moment was different. It wasn't just two political figures sparring under the glare of studio lights. It was a battle of symbols, a collision between two visions of what it means to belong in America. Karoline Leavitt had positioned herself as the voice of defiance, eager to brandish arrogance as confidence. To her, dismissiveness wasn't a flaw, it was theater. Every smirk, every scoff, every cutting remark was crafted to play to those who craved confrontation over substance. She wasn't just speaking to Patel, she was speaking to every immigrant, family, every minority voice, every person who had dared to claim space in a country they helped build. And in dismissing him, she dismissed them all. But Kash Patel represented something far weightier. He wasn't simply a panelist filling a chair, he embodied the quiet resilience of families who had crossed oceans, who had endured struggle, who had worked harder than anyone in rooms where they were never expected to belong. His calm strength stood in contrast to her brashness, a reminder that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. The stakes of this confrontation stretched far beyond policy or punditry. At its heart, this was about identity, about who gets to call themselves American, about whether arrogance could still define patriotism, or whether dignity could finally reclaim that word. It was a debate not just for the room, not just for the panel, but for millions watching who saw pieces of their own story, reflected in Patel's silence and Leavitt's sneer. The tension in the studio mirrored the tension across the nation. The United States, a country founded on both lofty ideals and painful contradictions, was watching itself play out on screen. Arrogance versus humility, exclusion versus inclusion, noise versus truth. Leavitt's words crackled with the energy of a performance, but performances fade. Patel's silence, his steadiness, his refusal to bite too early, carried a weight that would endure. And in that endurance lay a danger she hadn't anticipated, because silence isn't weakness, silence is strategy. And when silence breaks, it has the power to rewrite everything. For the viewers at home, The insult struck personal chords. Some remembered the names hurled at their parents in schoolyards. Some thought of the broken English mocked in workplaces. Others recalled being told in subtle or cruel ways that no matter how much they achieved, they would never be enough. Leavitt had spoken words they had heard all their lives, and Patel was about to deliver the response they had always dreamed of giving. The air in the studio was heavy, almost electric. Even those on the panel who aligned with Leavitt couldn't quite meet Patel's eyes. It was as though everyone sensed that the next few seconds would decide more than just a debate. They would decide who defined the room, arrogance or dignity. And as Patel prepared to speak, viewers felt the weight of history pressing in. This wasn't just a clash of egos. This wasn't just debate. What happened next wasn't just debate, it was history in the making. Karoline Leavitt's rise in politics was anything but quiet. From the moment she entered the national stage, she carried herself with the certainty of someone convinced she belonged at the center of every conversation. She was young, ambitious, and relentless in her pursuit of attention, qualities that made her both admired and resented. To her supporters, she was fresh energy, unafraid to say what others only whispered. To her critics, she was reckless, brash, and addicted to provocation. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. Whenever she was handed a microphone, the room braced for impact. She thrived not on persuasion but on domination. Every debate, every panel, every interview became a stage for verbal sparring, and she wielded her sharp tongue like a weapon. For Karoline, politics wasn't about conversation, it was about spectacle. Early in her career, she had caught headlines not for her policies, but for her words. In one interview, she dismissed her opponent as an old relic who should be collecting retirement checks instead of votes. In another, she cut down a reporter with a sneer, "Maybe learn how to ask real questions before you come back to me." Each jab won her a flash of attention, each insult a brief viral moment. She understood that in the age of social media, controversy traveled faster than compromise, but there was always a cost. Her tendency to mock, belittle, and dismiss left her isolated from allies who might have steadied her ambition. While she claimed strength, what many saw was insecurity, a desperate need to control the narrative by tearing others down before they could challenge her. The arrogance was clear, the smirk rehearsed, the pattern predictable. Her critics often asked, was there substance beneath the fire? Did the sound bites mask an emptiness she hoped no one would notice? Yet for Karoline, substance was secondary. Image was everything. She wasn't afraid of being called arrogant. She wore it like armor. After all, arrogance can be mistaken for strength when no one stands firm enough to expose it. And that became her trademark strategy: rely on the element of surprise, the sting of words, the destabilizing effect of contempt. When confronted with immigrants, she leaned into exclusion. When confronted with women of color in politics, she framed them as out of place. When confronted with those who dared to challenge her worldview, she mocked rather than debated. In her eyes, to dismiss was to win. What made her particularly dangerous was her composure in delivering the blow. She could dress down an opponent with a smile, turning cruelty into theater, masking bigotry as bravado. Audiences were left half shocked, half entertained, uncertain whether they had just witnessed confidence or cruelty. And Karoline thrived on that tension. But every strategy has its limit. For years, her sharp tongue had gone unchecked because her opponents either fumbled their responses or avoided confrontation altogether. She had learned to mistake silence for surrender and surrender for validation. No one had yet stood firm enough to mirror her words back to her, to expose the hollowness behind the arrogance. And so, when she faced Kash Patel, she believed she was stepping onto familiar ground. Another panel, another opponent she could define before he had the chance to speak. She leaned forward with the same smirk, the same practiced certainty, delivering her jab with the confidence of someone convinced the room would belong to her. But this time, something was different. The silence that followed wasn't weakness. The steadiness in Patel's gaze wasn't uncertainty. For once, Karoline wasn't in control of the script. What she didn't realize was that this time, She was aiming at someone uniquely prepared to respond, long before the cameras and the headlines. Kash Patel's story began in the quiet determination of a family that believed in the American promise. His parents came to the United States with little more than their dreams and an unshakable faith. That sacrifice would yield opportunity. They worked long hours, accepted the struggles of being outsiders, and carried the quiet dignity of people who built a life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. Their journey was not glamorous, but it was profoundly American. Kash grew up watching his parents navigate two worlds, one of tradition, the other of reinvention. At home, their roots were preserved in the food they cooked, the stories they told, the values they instilled. Outside, they faced the sharp edges of doubt and dismissal. Neighbors who questioned their accents. Teachers who assumed their son wouldn't keep up. Classmates who repeated cruel stereotypes without understanding the pain behind them. Each slight, each dismissal, carved into Kash not bitterness, but resilience. He learned early that dignity was not given, it was claimed, and he learned to claim it through perseverance. Education became his weapon, discipline his shield. While others underestimated him, Kash pressed forward, one step at a time. From classrooms to law schools, from courtrooms to the halls of government, he carried with him the unyielding lesson his parents had modeled. You belong not because someone grants you permission, but because you earn your place every single day. Patel's path into public service wasn't accidental, he believed deeply. In the duty to give back to the country that had given his family a home, he worked as a prosecutor, standing in courtrooms where the stakes were justice itself. He worked in national security, navigating the complexities of law and policy. And through it all, he carried himself with the same steady composure that had defined his upbringing. But it wasn't just his resume that mattered. It was the spirit behind it. Kash Patel represented a broader truth about America, that identity is not a limitation, but a strength. That the child of immigrants could rise to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who once doubted his family's place. That perseverance could outshine prejudice. For many, Patel became a quiet symbol of what was possible. He wasn't the loudest in the room. He wasn't chasing viral moments or seeking headlines through insult. His power lay in calm clarity, in the kind of confidence that doesn't need to dominate to be undeniable. When others raised their voices, Patel leaned on precision. When others sought spectacle, he chose substance. And yet, for all his accomplishments, there were always those ready to question him, to suggest he was still an outsider. It was a reminder that no matter how much one gives, arrogance will always seek to diminish. But Patel had long ago stopped fearing dismissal. Every insult only deepened his resolve. Every attempt to erase him only made him more certain of the ground he stood on. It is this background, the struggles of a family that sacrificed. It's the perseverance of a boy who grew into a man of service, the dignity of someone who never forgot where he came from, that framed the moment on that stage. For Patel, Leavitt's words were not new. They were echoes of every smirk his parents endured, every slight he faced in childhood, every headline that questioned belonging. But where others might have faltered, Patel saw clarity. This was not just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and that is why he waited. That is why he did not rush to interrupt or retaliate. Because Patel understood the weight of silence, the power of patience, the strength of choosing the precise moment to strike. The cameras might have caught a man sitting quietly under the glare of insult, but those who knew his story recognized something else, the gathering of conviction, the calm before revelation. His entire journey, every sacrifice, every struggle, had prepared him for moments exactly like this. And that journey gave him the strength. For the single reply that would shatter the panel, the air in the studio had shifted. Leavitt leaned back. In her chair, emboldened by the silence that followed her jab, convinced she had seized control of the narrative. She pressed on, her words dripping with certainty. Her tone designed to needle. You talk a lot about service, Kash, but service doesn't change what you are. People like you will never understand what this country needs. The panel stirred uneasily. One guest coughed into a fist, Another shifted papers to avoid eye contact. The moderator attempted a polite redirection, but Leavitt ignored him, her voice climbing above his. She wasn't done, not yet. This is America. We don't need lectures from outsiders pretending to be patriots. We need real leaders who know what it means to be one of us. Each word was sharper than the last, the arrogance laid bare, unashamed. And yet Patel remained steady, hands folded, expression calm. He didn't rise to her bait, didn't cut her off, he didn't match her volume, simply listened, and that quiet restraint only magnified her desperation. For the audience watching at home, tension was unbearable. Viewers could feel the disrespect radiating from her words, could hear the subtext in every syllable. This wasn't policy disagreement. This was dismissal at its rawest. Every immigrant family, every child told to go back where you came from. Every American who had fought for recognition felt their pulse quicken as Leavitt's voice thundered, unchecked. But in the studio, the energy was beginning to turn. At first, her interruptions had drawn murmurs of approval from a few corners. But now, those murmurs were drowned by the discomfort spreading across the room. What had started as political theater was now teetering into cruelty. And cruelty, when unmasked, never wins the room for long. Patel's silence wasn't weakness. It was a mirror. Every time she interrupted, every time she sneered, arrogance became clearer, not just to the panel, but to the nation watching. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. The moderator gave her another chance to step back, to let Patel respond. But she shook her head, pressing forward with a final flourish. The words she was certain would end the debate. Face it, Kash. You don't belong here. You never will. The insult reverberated through the studio like a gunshot. Few gasps broke the silence. Even those who had cheered her on before were stunned into stillness. She had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. Patel drew a breath, calm and measured. He leaned forward, not with anger, not with a raised voice, but with the quiet authority of someone who carried history in his bones. The audience felt the air change, the anticipation swell, after sitting through every barb after allowing her arrogance to peak. He was ready, and then with one sentence, Patel flipped the entire room. Patel's pause was deliberate. He let the silence hang, let the weight of Leavitt's final insult settle on the room. She had expected him to explode, to defend himself with equal fire, to trade jab for jab. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, as though every second of stillness drew more gravity into the air. His hands remained folded, his voice low but clear, every syllable sharpened by restraint rather than rage. You say I don't belong here, Patel began, his tone steady. But here is exactly where I was meant to be. The words weren't shouted. They weren't delivered with theatrics. And yet they hit with the force of a hammer. The audience shifted, leaning in, sensing that the reply they had been waiting for was finally beginning. He let the moment breathe, eyes fixed on Leavitt. She smirked faintly, trying to hold on to the performance, but her confidence was already slipping. Patel continued, each sentence building carefully, patiently. My parents came to this country with nothing but faith and hard work. They weren't handed a stage. They weren't given a microphone. They weren't welcomed with open arms. But they believed in America enough to sacrifice everything so that I could sit here today. Gasps rippled through the audience. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reclamation. He wasn't defending himself. He was redefining the entire conversation. They told us we didn't belong. Too, Patel went on. In classrooms, in neighborhoods, in workplaces. But belonging isn't something you're given. Belonging is something you earn. My family earned it, day by day, year by year, through service, through sacrifice, through unshakable faith in this country. Leavitt shifted in her seat now, her smirk thinning. For the first time, she looked less like a confident performer and more like someone caught in a story she could not control. Patel's voice never wavered. You call me an outsider, yet I've spent my life serving the very nation you claim to protect. As a prosecutor, I stood for justice in American courts. As a national security official, I defended our Constitution. I didn't just talk about America, I worked to keep it safe. The audience erupted into applause, short and sharp, before the moderator waved for quiet. The cameras zoomed closer. Patel didn't break stride. And so when you tell me I don't belong, you're not just talking to me, but you're talking to every immigrant family who picked up this country's flag and believed in it more fiercely than those who try to tear others down. You're talking to the soldiers' children, to the factory workers, to the small business owners who built communities from nothing. You're talking to the millions who prove every day that America is bigger than arrogance. The crowd gasped again. Even the panelists, who had sat frozen now, looked at Patel with a mixture of awe and unease. His words weren't angry, they were resolute. That calm dignity was devastating. Leavitt tried to cut in, but Patel raised a hand slightly, not to silence her with force, but with authority. The interruption died on her lips. For the first time all evening, the stage was undeniably his. He leaned in closer. His voice softer now, almost intimate, as if speaking directly to every viewer at home. America doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who give the most. My family gave everything to this country. And I sit here as proof that no insult, no sneer, no arrogance can take that away. The studio fell utterly silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the creak of a chair. Patel's words had frozen the room in a rare electric stillness. And then came the line, the sentence that cut sharper than any insult, that shattered the arrogance built up over the entire debate. Patel turned his gaze fully on Leavitt, his voice firm, unshaking. You question whether I belong here. The truth is, I've served this country more in a single day than your words could ever serve it in a lifetime. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps erupted. A wave of applause surged through the audience before anyone could stop it. The moderator, caught between control and awe, let it roll. Panelists exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling faintly as if justice had just been delivered in real time. Leavitt froze, her face pale beneath the studio lights. The smirk was gone, replaced with a flicker of something she hadn't anticipated, doubt. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. He simply returned to his calm posture, hands folded expression. Composed, it wasn't triumph born of arrogance. It was victory born of truth. And that made it undeniable. The audience at home felt the shift too. Viewers who had clenched their fists in anger at her insults now exhaled with relief. Children of immigrants saw themselves vindicated. Families saw decades of sacrifice honored. Patel's reply wasn't just a rebuttal, it was representation. In living rooms, people replayed the moment, mouths open, goosebumps rising. Social media lit up within seconds, though the studio didn't yet know it. Hashtags began forming. Clips were snipped, captions written. Mic drop. Wasn't a cliche tonight, it was reality. For years, Karoline Leavitt had cut down opponents with her sharp tongue, leaving them scrambling for footing. She had hurled her most pointed dismissal, and Patel had transformed it into a universal truth, a rallying cry that extended far beyond the walls of the studio. The room remained suspended in that silence, a silence that belonged not to insult, but to dignity. And in that silence, everyone knew the balance had shifted, performance had ended, truth had spoken. But the real shock came after the cameras stopped rolling, the moment the debate wrapped. The room was still buzzing, but the real storm had already started brewing online. Clips of his words began appearing across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The sentence that silenced Karoline Leavitt, "I've served this country more in a single day than your words could ever serve it in a lifetime," was already being cut into captions, stitched into reactions, and replayed in slow motion with dramatic music. By the time the panelists had stepped off stage, a hashtag had begun to trend. Hashtag Patel mic drop. Alongside it, other phrases popped up. Hashtag AMERICANNESS. Hashtag truth over arrogance. And the cheekier hashtag go back to history, a reference to Leavitt's dismissive tone that now seemed painfully out of touch. Memes spread like wildfire. Ow. One showed Patel seated calmly with the caption, "Cooler than the other side of the pillow." Another had Leavitt's frozen reaction face paired with the words, "When the roast is too real." A TikTok creator slowed down Patel's pause before delivering the final, line, overlaying it with dramatic beats that made it feel like the climax of a blockbuster movie, news networks scrambled. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, regardless of political leaning, each rolled the clip on repeat, framing it as the defining moment of the night. Conservative commentators tried to spin Leavitt's stumble as out of context, but even some on her side admitted it had been a rare misstep. On The Daily Show, a skit featured a fake referee blowing a whistle and declaring, "And that's a technical. Knockout, folks." Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel quipped, "That wasn't a debate, that was a verbal exorcism." Celebrities joined the chorus. Haas. Hazen Minhaj tweeted. Immigrant parents everywhere just stood up and clapped. Mindy Kaling posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "Dignity wins, every time." Even Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson chimed in, writing, "Respect. Calm strength always beats loud weakness." For Patel supporters, it was vindication. For Leavitt's critics, it was proof that arrogance eventually eats itself alive. For ordinary viewers, it was entertainment, but the kind that lingered. What struck people most wasn't just the words themselves, but how Patel delivered them. He hadn't yelled, hadn't mocked, hadn't matched insult with insult. He'd simply laid down truth with a surgeon's precision. And that contrast, calm dignity against sneering arrogance, made the moment unforgettable. Political analysts noted how rare it was for a debate exchange to break through the noise of a media-saturated world. This wasn't just a zinger, one strategist observed on MSNBC. This was a cultural moment. It touched something deeper about identity, dignity, and who gets to claim Americanness. Leavitt, meanwhile, went quiet on social media. Official account released a brief statement insisting she had been mischaracterized and that the debate had been one-sided editing. But her silence in the hours afterward told a different story. Comment sections flooded with Patel's line, repeated again and again, until it became less a quote and more a verdict. Clips of Patel's words reached millions within 24 hours. On YouTube, reaction channels dissected every pause, every facial expression, framing it as the moment arrogance collapsed. Political TikTok users stitched the video into montages about immigrant stories. Now motivational speakers began quoting it in entirely new contexts, from leadership seminars to classroom lectures, even outside the political sphere. The exchange resonated. Sports commentators compared it to a championship knockout. Business leaders referenced it in discussions about humility and leadership. Teachers played it for students as an example of how calmness and truth can overpower mockery. It was, in short, more than a viral clip. It became a symbol, truth defeating arrogance, dignity, silencing noise. And yet, beneath the noise, Patel's reply carried a lesson far deeper than politics. When the dust finally settled, and the hashtags began to fade into the endless churn of news cycles, something lingered. It wasn't just a memory of Patel's reply, it was the feeling it stirred. People weren't just entertained. They were reminded of something fundamental. In that single moment, Patel had embodied the lesson that dignity, when held firm, always outlasts arrogance. Think about it. Leavitt had volume, interruption, and insult. She had the sneer, the smirk, the dismissive shrug that so often wins cheap applause. Patel had none of that. What he had instead was truth, spoken with the kind of clarity that cuts through the fog. And when truth is delivered without anger, without malice, it lands with the weight of something larger than the room it's spoken in. That's why the clip spread the way it did, not because it was flashy, but because it was timeless. Patel reminded millions of people that calm strength is not weakness. It is the deepest kind of power. In a political culture addicted to noise, his silence before speaking was louder than any insult hurled his way. For many immigrants and children of immigrants, the exchange wasn't just about politics, it was personal. They saw in Patel's composure the reflection of their parents' sacrifices, the nights of being underestimated, the mornings of being told they didn't belong, the daily grind of proving themselves twice over. And yet, just like Patel, they held their ground not with fury, but with resilience. His reply became their reply. His victory felt like theirs too. For others, it touched the broader American promise. The idea that Americanness is not measured by where your ancestors came from, but by the values you choose to stand for: respect, service, justice. Patel's moment turned that promise from an abstract principle into something lived, real, undeniable. And here lies the deeper truth. Arrogance is loud, but it burns out quickly. Dignity is quiet, but it endures. The clash between Patel and Leavitt wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a parable about the kind of strength that truly matters. Patel showed that you don't need to shout to be heard, don't need to belittle to stand tall, and you don't need to erase others to prove your worth. What you need is conviction. What you need is composure. What you need is the courage to let truth speak for itself. That's why this story will be remembered, not just replayed. Because long after the trending hashtags vanish, the lesson remains. Dignity always wins. It may not win instantly. It may not win with fireworks or cheers, but it wins in the way. That counts. In the silence of a room stunned into respect, in the pride swelling in the hearts of those who see themselves reflected, and in the reminder that America's greatest strength has always been its ability to rise above arrogance and choose respect instead. And so, Patel's reply was more than a comeback. It was a mirror, showing America what it still can be when it remembers its best self. But if the moral was clear, the story wasn't finished. Because what Patel's words unleashed wasn't just applause, it was a call that would echo beyond that debate stage into living rooms, classrooms, conversations across the country. And that call leads us to the final chapter. Karoline Leavitt thought she was in control. Sharp words, quick dismissals, the confidence of someone who believed she couldn't be touched. But she was caught off guard, because Kash Patel's reply didn't just answer her. It broke the panel, shattered the arrogance, and reminded everyone watching that dignity still carries the final word. That's the heart of this story. Not politics, not points scored, but principle. The principle that arrogance can roar as loudly as it wants, but one steady voice of truth will always outlast it. And Patel proved that on that stage. It's why millions shared the clip. Why the hashtags trended. It's why for a brief moment, people across the country looked at each other and felt something they hadn't in a long time. Pride. Pride that Americanness isn't about volume, it's about values. Pride that resilience, respect, and justice still have defenders. And now, it's your turn. If you believe dignity speaks louder than arrogance, share this story. Let it travel further. Let it remind others of what strength really looks like. And if you want to be part of a movement that refuses to let truth be silenced, a movement that thrives on calm courage, on stories that inspire, on voices that matter, subscribe now. Because this isn't just about one debate, one clapback, or one viral moment. This is about a future where arrogance loses its grip, and dignity takes its rightful place at the center of the American story. The panel may have ended that night, but the echo of Patel's words, that's still just beginning.